but like I'm not an international lawyer. I can't tell you what constitutes genocide. And, yeah. Right. I also don't know how many people have died because the numbers are coming from Hamas.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Woodmont Christian Church. Welcome to those that are joining us on the live stream. Great to be here and for this Wednesday night conversation with AJ Levine. Guys, for a video, and then I'll introduce our guest that many of you have heard many times before. Maybe some of you haven't, but.
Start with you, AJ. Tell us a little bit about growing up and what it was like to essentially, I suppose, grow up as a Jew in a distinctly Christian community, as far as I'm aware.
Oh, not only distinctly Christian, but distinctly Roman Catholic. I grew up in New England, in Massachusetts, in a neighborhood that was almost entirely Portuguese Roman Catholic. So I grew up with Our Lady of Fatima. I used to go to Mass with my friends because it got me out of Sunday school. And when I was a little child, I liked going to Mass. The services were shorter than they were in the synagogue. But other than that, it was pretty much the same thing. It was a bunch of guys in robes speaking in a language I didn't understand, and there was a lot of sitting up and sitting down. And the major difference was that you got fed during the Mass, but you got fed after Sunday school, right? So my parents told me that Christianity, which for them meant Catholicism, was very, very much like Judaism. We worship the same God, the one who created heaven and earth. We pray the same prayers, most notably the Psalms. We take authority from the same books, whether it's Genesis or Isaiah or the book of Esther. So we're related. So my initial sense of the church was it was like the synagogue we did not go to, because in the town next door there were 3 synagogues, and there's the one we went to, and there's the one my Uncle Arnold went to that my father would never set foot in because he didn't like the rabbi. And then there was, and it was all part of the same thing. And we all went to public school. So religious education class was after school. And we'd get on the bus that took us to school in the morning, to first grade, to second grade. And we'd talk about what we learned in religious education class. I in the next town in Hebrew school, and they at catechism. And every once in a while we had, you have Moses? We have Moses. You have David? We have David. And then my Christian friends had a bunch of other people, and I'd go home and ask who's this Jesus guy? And who? Everybody was named Mary. All the women were Mary. And my parents would say, oh, they're Jews. I went, oh, like they're part of the family, but, the family we don't talk to. So my initial sense of Christianity, and it's still my sense of Christianity, it's a relative, and there are some problems as we've aged and the branches of those family have moved in different directions. And then a little kid said to me on the bus when I was 7, you killed our Lord. And that created some other questions that were not quite so friendly. So not only, as you mentioned, have I dedicated my entire academic career to looking at Jesus in the Gospels to recover the Jewishness, I've also dedicated it to help Christians read their Gospels and understand their Lord without having to import anti-Jewish stereotypes. I think Jesus looks fabulous. I think he's terrific. I would have a glass of wine with it, because he'd pay right, with no problem whatsoever. I don't think you need to make Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good. And it bothers me that so often that happens in Christian preaching and teaching. Wow, I've never seen that.
You were in it.
I wasn't. I don't watch me, because you can't fix it. And then I think I probably spoke too quickly, but they were in Canada, so that would be okay. I don't watch me on video because you can't do anything. At least when you write a book, you can look it over when you get the page proofs. Once something is taped, it's taped.
That's right.
I'm actually pretty proud of that.
That was good. That's good. All right. Well, I want to introduce AJ. She is a world-renowned New Testament scholar, taught for many, many years at Vanderbilt Divinity School and Vanderbilt University. She did her PhD at Duke and has published numerous books, articles, journals, and she's been a friend of mine for a long time, a friend of this church, and that she's come to Woodmont many times over the years to speak. But let's welcome AJ Levine back to
Thank
Woodmont.
you.
So we're going to do this in a dialogue format, but she's going to do most of the talking. I'm just going to prod her with some questions. And then we are going to save time at the end for questions from those that are here. But can you tell us just a little bit about your life and background. You talked about it some in that clip, but tell us, about growing up and your family and anything you want to add to what you said there.
The bottom line is this kid accused me of killing God. I thought that was weird because I understood Christianity to be, as I said on the tape, sort of much like Judaism, the same books, the same God, the same prayers. And I'm stunned that when people are part of different groups, whether different religions or, I don't know, different political parties, or they graduate from different schools, or they like different sports teams, that they wind up demonizing that other group. And the closer we are, the easier it is to demonize. So I'm tired of Christians misunderstanding Judaism. I'm tired of Jews misunderstanding Christianity. We got problems on both sides. So I've spent my life trying to be a bridge between the two communities. We come together as one community when we're talking about Jesus, because Jesus is a Jew talking to other Jews. We are now separate communities. And I think when the Messianic age comes in full flower, whether we call it the kingdom of heaven or in Hebrew, the Olam Haba, the world to come, I think just as we started together, we end together, because we all claim to be worshiping the same God. I just want to keep us without bearing false witness against each other while we wait for that end time. So that's why I do what I do. I have a partner. I have two kids. For those of you from Nashville, my kids went to the Akiva Day School, then to Meg's Magnet, then to Hume Fogg, and my daughter came back to Nashville. So I'm not quite a Nashville native. I think I need another 4 generations, but I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
So would you say that what happened on the bus when you were a child played a big role in why you became a New Testament scholar?
Yeah, it played a huge role. Because if that didn't happen, I would have gone to law school like my mother wanted, and I would be on the Supreme Court. Well, depending upon who the president would be.
What are some of the common misunderstandings that Christians have about Jesus?
How long do we have? Oh, my goodness.
As long as you want.
Thank you. Dangerous for an academic. The major misunderstanding is that most Christians do not understand the context, the first century Jewish context, what life was like in Galilee in the north, Judea in the south. Judea is where Jerusalem is, that's where the temple is. And if we get the context wrong, we're going to get Jesus wrong. In the same way that if we don't understand the context of 19th century America, we're not going to understand Abraham Lincoln or the Civil War. If we get the 1960s context wrong, we're not going to understand John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr. or so on. So we need to know the context. What I frequently find from my students, my job at Vanderbilt was to teach Christians who wanted to become ordained ministers or religious educators how to read the New Testament, which is a very strange job for a Jew who goes to an Orthodox synagogue in Nashville. But somebody's got to do it. And I understood from them where a lot of those misconceptions came from. So a number of my students thought that first century Judaism was burdened by this horrible law, 613 commandments, and if the Jews did not fulfill every single one of them perfectly, then this angry Old Testament God of wrath would strike them with leprosy or strike them with lightning. No, it wasn't like that at all. The law is actually very, very easy to follow. There are more laws, by the way, on the books of the state of Tennessee than there are in the entire Talmud. And we follow them very easily because our system is designed to do so. So we don't have to worry when we walk into Kroger's or Publix, or here that we're in Green Hills, Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, that we're going to buy something that would be not permitted to eat because they're not going to serve it in the first place. So Jesus is not worried about following the dietary regulations because he's not about to get lobster or clam or pork sandwiches at the local deli in Nazareth. Following Torah is for Jews, it's a sign of blessing. It's a way of affirming our own practice. And it's especially important when the Romans came in. So the Roman Empire conquering, Ben-Hur, or Charlton Heston in a chariot, any movie with Charlton Heston in a chariot. Because when we eat a particular way, when we dress a particular way, when we take one day off a week to celebrate the Sabbath, which the Romans thought was the height of laziness. What, you take a day off? How absurd. What we're doing is we're saying we're not Romans. We are affirming our own identity, and that's what people do under colonial situations.
That's in part why Jews are still here, and many of the other nations in antiquity, the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Hyksos and so on, they're not with us anymore because they did not have that system to keep them in place. A number of my students think that first century Judaism was horrible about women. It marginalized women, it made them oppressed and suppressed and repressed and depressed. And then Jesus comes along and invents feminism and I believe the pantsuit. But it actually turns out that we can use the Gospels as an excellent source for recovering women's history at the period. And what do we learn? Women owned their own homes. So I'm trusting some of you know the Gospels. Yeah. So Martha welcomes Jesus into her home. The church in Jerusalem following the death of Jesus is at the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark. Women have access to their own funds, like the woman who anoints Jesus, whether on his head in Matthew and Mark, on his feet in Luke and in John, or the poor woman who puts her 2 coins in the temple treasury. Those are her coins. They have freedom of travel. So as we come up toward Advent, when Mary goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, nobody's saying, excuse me, you're a woman, how could you possibly be on the road? She can, because women have freedom of travel. They show up in synagogues like the bent-over lady. Jesus says she's bent over by Satan. I think she's bent over by osteoporosis. But Satan and osteoporosis are not mutually exclusive. They play on the same team. They appear in public like the bleeding lady who thinks she maybe can steal a healing from Jesus. So women followed Jesus not because they were oppressed and repressed and suppressed and therefore depressed by Judaism. They followed Jesus because he healed their bodies, because there was something about his proclamation of the kingdom of heaven that spoke to their hearts. And I think in particular, when people want to talk about Jesus being radical, because today, if anything that's important has to be radical, right? It's like an overused term. Where he's radical, whereas most people, not all people, but most Jews of his time period got married and had babies because that's what you did. I think he was celibate, and I think the people around him are celibate, which means that the women who followed him generally appeared to be without husbands, so maybe never married, maybe widowed, maybe divorced, maybe deserted, or women who could not have children, because infertility would be considered then, as it is now, a type of disability. It means your body's not doing what you want it to do or what society expects it to do. And Jesus says, it doesn't really matter if you're married or not. It doesn't really matter if you have kids or not. And we can see this in the Gospel of Luke. At one point, another woman in public calls out to Jesus, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast that nursed you," which I like because it's gynecological imagery in public. So I don't like that. And Jesus says, "More blessed are those who hear the will of God and do it." In other words, the most important thing in your life is not getting married and making babies. The most important thing in your life is doing the will of God. And I think for single women and women who could not have children, that's exceptionally good news. I'll stop there.
So I've heard you talk on many different aspects of the New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount, the parables, Paul's letters. I want to talk about the Sermon on the Mount for just a minute. And many years ago, I heard you say, it's kind of like the greatest hits of Jesus. That's how you described it. Do you see the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, as the core or the heart of Christian teaching? How would you introduce the Sermon on the Mount as a New Testament scholar and somebody who's taught many, many ministers over the years?
Yeah. I do think it's Jesus' greatest hits because I think Matthew collected all this stuff from a bunch of different sources and put it all together. And you can find several of the materials that show up in Matthew's chapter 5 through 7, dispersed in Mark, dispersed in Luke, hinted at in Paul. Because Matthew's a very good organizer. Matthew has written, in effect, the driver's ed manual for Christians. Jesus' greatest hits, chapters 5 through 7. How to run a mission, chapter 10. A bunch of parables, chapter 13. How to run a church, chapter 18. End of the world, 24 and 25. And with Christmas at the beginning and the Passion narrative and Easter at the end and some healings and some controversy stories in between. So you can find your way around Matthew really, really easily. Is it the heart of Christianity? It might be the heart of Christian ethics. I don't think it's the heart of Christian teaching, because if it were, then we'd only need Matthew and we wouldn't need the rest of the stuff. So if we want to get to the heart of how the church felt about Jesus, then we need to go to the Gospel of John. if we want to understand how Gentiles, how non-Jews, become part of this community, worshiping the God of Israel, who's also the God of the world, but how did Gentiles get into the system? How did pagans get in? Well, then we need the letters of Paul. If we want to have a sense of how some people imagined the end of the world, which was super important for a lot of these folks, then we need the book of Revelation. If we want to understand how the Old Testament anticipates the New and how the two texts relate to each other, the Epistle to the Hebrews is probably our best bet. If we want to understand super good ethics for churches, like if somebody who's poor walks into your assembly, what do? The Epistle of James. So once we start picking and choosing, this text is more important than that text, we're already making a judgment that is going to sell part of that Christian tradition short. That's why I like reading the entire New Testament and figuring I need this text today, for this is what I need to do today. Because here's my ethical concern. I need this text for tomorrow because I need to think more deeply about my relationship with the Christ. I'm going to go here.
Do you think that the ethic that is set forth in the Sermon on the Mount, is it impossible? Can we achieve it? Or is it simply an ideal that we are always striving to achieve, recognizing that we're going to fall short?
Yeah, because you're asking a both-and question, to which I think the answer is yes. So the Sermon on the Mount, among other things, Jesus says, be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's setting the bar fairly high, right? It starts out, your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. That's high, but eventually you have to be as perfect as God. So my mother, not God, but they're on the same spectrum. When I would come home from school, and I was a very good student, and I would have an A on a paper or 100 on an exam, my mother would look at it and she would smile and she would say, why didn't you get an A+? Why didn't you get 105? And I would say, because there were only 100 points. And she would say, you could have done better. Now, she was enormously proud of me, and I know that. And I was very affirmed as a child. I was very, very well parented. But my mother's sense was you could always do it a little bit better. And I think that's how Jesus was. I mean, he's setting the bar super high because why not? We can always be better than we are in this kind of movement along toward whatever that perfection is. And if we don't make it, that's okay because we get do-overs. That's called repentance, or go fix it, or say you're sorry, or I didn't get it done today, but I will get it done tomorrow. So I think it's both. Can we get there? We can do our damnedest.
We have to keep trying.
I think so. And we know that even if we come up short, just as my mother still loved me, unconditionally loved me, we have that same sense from God, so that when we do screw up, God is there to take care of us. And we know that right from the beginning of Genesis. Adam and Eve screw up royally. When they leave Eden, God goes with them. Cain screws up even more, and Cain gets a mark of protection so that nobody will attack him. Noah screws up when he gets off the ark. He gets drunk, bad things happen, but God still remains faithful to the covenant that God gave with Noah. So we as human beings have been screwing up since the moment of creation, and God's still with us. Are we getting any better? I'd like to think so. I don't, but I'd like to think so.
Jesus taught in parables. So my question for you is, why do you think Jesus taught in parables? And you published a great book, Short Stories of Jesus. What are some of your favorites?
Well, parables were a known genre at the time. So here's another place where a number of my Christian students have miscued, because they tend to think of parables as stories with morals. Do you remember Aesop's fables, like the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady wins the race? Which is somewhat, it's true, and nobody really wants to know that because we want to rush through things. Parables are not quite moral stories. There's the same genre, but not quite the same thing. Parables in Jewish culture are designed to help us think of things otherwise, to see the world in a different way. One biblical scholar talked about parables as teasing the mind into active imagination, with the idea being that if we can think something that hasn't been thought before, or to quote the Scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz, something you've never thunk before, then you might actually be able to do it, if you can just imagine it. So the parable that I've been thinking about most recently is the parable, sometimes called the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's only in the Gospel of Luke. Luke has most of the really good parables, like the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan. Parables do not come with titles. Jesus is not walking around with 3x5 note cards labeled Good Samaritan, prodigal son, laborers in the vineyard, right? I'm not even sure he could read, by the way. I think Luke actually gives him an upgrade. Most people at the time can't, right? Intelligence has nothing to do with literacy, right? Literacy is a special skill in antiquity. What is the parable? A lawyer, lawyers, just check.
We have a few.
Not to insult. But in the gospel, when lawyers do things, it's usually negatively coded. So not to insult, not your fault. A lawyer stands up to test Jesus. He says to Jesus, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? The question is, the word do here is in a Greek text called, a tense called the aorist. He's thinking of a single issue, like check it off the to-do list. If he's efficient, he can inherit eternal life before breakfast. You know, take out the dry cleaning, inherit eternal life, good to go. Jesus says to him, and this is answering a question with a question, which is sometimes called the Socratic method. You answer a question with a question. It's Jewish. So Jesus says, what's written in the Torah, what is written in the law, what do you read there? And the lawyer responds by quoting Deuteronomy chapter 5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and he adds in with all your mind. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's Leviticus 19. Jesus says, do this and you will live. And here we see him changing the question, because the original question was basically, what do I need for eternal life? Jesus is not interested in that. He's interested in how people live ethically with one another in the here and now. That's the major focus. That's the Sermon on the Mount. That's the ethics. So the lawyer, who's feeling a little bit embarrassed because he was putting Jesus to the test and the test didn't work, says, so who is my neighbor? Which I used to think was a very snarky question, because asking who is my neighbor can be who is not my neighbor, who cannot move into my backyard, right? This person moves in, the property rates are going to go down. If this person moves in, they're going to build up a big fence, and then I'm not going to be able to have the view. Who cannot be my neighbor? It actually turns out it's a very good question. So those of you who are lawyers, all groups need to know who the neighbors are. Neighbors are one of us. In you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Neighbor means fellow Israelite, fellow Jew. Because we need to know who's one of us. For example, a neighbor would be an American citizen, people who can vote in our elections. Canadians, they're not neighbors because they don't get to vote in our elections. A neighbor would be somebody who can serve on a committee in this church, generally a member of this church. I'm not a member of this church. I am not a neighbor. So we need to know who the neighbors are. Leviticus 19 goes on to say, you have to love the stranger. The Hebrew term is ger, and it means something like not native born, or in modern terms, migrant. You have to love the migrant who dwells among you because you were migrants. You were not native born in the land of Egypt. In other words, you love the neighbor because the neighbor's like you, member of the same community, with the same beliefs, the same values, the same practices. You love the stranger because you knew what it was like to be an alien, a stranger, an emigrant in some other land, and you knew how bad that got. Slavery followed by genocide. So you love the neighbor who's one of you, and you love the stranger because you know what it's like to be a stranger. So who is my neighbor is a good question. Who has the same rights and responsibilities that I do, and who's not my neighbor? At the time, by the way, Samaritans were the test case, because Samaritans, they worship the same God that the Jews worship. They claim ancestry, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They see themselves as the descendants of the so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel. They have the same Bible, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, almost the same. So the question was, are they in or are they out? Churches do the same thing. So there are some churches where to participate in communion or Eucharist, these should be familiar terms?
Yes.
Lord's Supper, whatever you want to call it. There are some churches where anybody can come forward and participate, and there are some churches where you have to be baptized member of that church in order to participate. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, we have an open table here.
I thought you did.
Always had a hard time with the sacrament that's meant to bring people together being used to say just
drive people apart.
Yeah,
it is weird.
Yeah.
Jews find that weird. That's why we feed you afterwards, because then there's no question.
Right.
Churches need to know who neighbors are and who strangers are, and sometimes it's an open table, and sometimes it's a closed table. So at this point, Jesus doesn't want to get into a whole disquisition about who counts as neighbor and who doesn't, whether the Samaritans are en route. So he tells a parable. Now, parables are designed to help us think otherwise. So the parable, I'm trusting you know this. A fellow's going down the Jerusalem to Jericho road. He's waylaid by robbers, beaten, stripped, robbed, and left half dead in a ditch. And then two people walk by who should have stopped to help. The first, a priest. Priesthood in Judaism is inherited. In Judaism, if your father's a priest, you're a priest. Roman Catholicism, not so much. Think about that for a minute. And the priest walks by, and the second person who walks by is a Levite. Levites are like temple workers, temple singers, or sort of secondary priests. And in Judaism, if your father's a Levite, you're a Levite. And we know that to this day. You can often tell by last names. So if you meet somebody like me, my last name is Levine. My dad was a Levite. This means I'm a Levite. My kids are not, because the priestly line and the Levitical line is from the father, and their dad is not a Levite, and he's not a priest. So you're either a Kohen, a priest, a Levite, a subordinate priest, or you're just an Israelite. You're descended from Jacob's other kids. Everybody with me on this so far? Countless commentators explain, see if this sounds familiar to you, that the reason the priest and the Levite walk by the guy in the ditch is that they're afraid if they touch him and he's dead, or if he dies while they are attending him, then they will become ritually impure from having touched a corpse. So the reason they walked by is to avoid becoming impure. Does that sound familiar to anybody? I see hands. Look at that. Wrong. It's totally wrong. Now, when biblical scholars make claims, you can always say to us, how do you know that? Which is a really good question, because sometimes we just make stuff up, and because we do. And sometimes we repeat stuff that our teachers told us without ever bothering to say, how do you know that? So that's actually what I was taught when I started studying New Testament. And I thought to myself, well, that sounds weird, because in Judaism, there are weightier commandments and there are less weightier commandments. We can actually see that language in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, when Jesus accuses the Pharisees of neglecting the weightier commandments of the law, justice and mercy, and paying attention to the less weighty ones like tithing mint, right? Doing works of justice is more important than tithing stuff from your spice box. Okay. Saving a life is one of the highest commandments we have, because you live by the law, you don't die by it. They should have stopped. There is a law still observed by practicing Jews to this day, that if you are a priest, remember you're a priest if your dad's a priest, if you are a priest and there's a funeral, unless it's the funeral of a parent, a spouse, a sibling, or a child, you can go to the funeral, but you don't set foot on the cemetery grounds. You stand outside the fence to this day. But there's no such law incumbent upon a Levite. No problem with touching corpses. We have to touch corpses. That's how Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus get the corpse of Jesus from the cross into the tomb. That's why the women go to the tomb on Sunday morning to anoint the corpse. If you touch a corpse, are you ritually impure? Yes. Do you care? No. Most people are ritually impure most of the time, and most don't care. If you are menstruating, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but if you're menstruating, you are ritually impure. If you just had a baby within the past 40 days, you shouldn't be here. But you would be ritually impure. If you ejaculated a man within the past 24 hours, you are ritually impure. I'm not going to ask for hands on that either, but we'll see who's smiling. It's not a problem, and there are easy ways to regain impurity. So why don't they stop? There's no good explanation for this, but the parable already raises the question of when do we do what's best for us rather than take the time to do what's best for somebody else. Martin Luther King Jr., preaching on this parable, provided them a motive. Luke gives them no motive whatsoever. King said, I'm not sure why the priest and the Levite passed by the fellow on the ditch, but here's what my imagination tells me. My imagination tells me that these men were afraid. The priest and the Levite asked themselves, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? Because there are bandits on the road. But the Samaritan who does stop asks a different question. This is King's language. The Samaritan asks himself, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? That's the better question. And then King went on to say, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, this is the strike in Memphis, what will happen to them? So King stopped to help, and he's assassinated because he stopped to help. This is what it means to take up your cross. It means to do something for the benefit of someone else and suppress your own concerns for the sake of loving the neighbor. I think that's brilliant. The Samaritan takes care of the man. He pours oil and water on his wounds, which already reminded me of salad dressing. Oil and water, but it was medicinal. Puts him on his animal, takes him to Jericho, and takes care of him. Right? Says to the innkeeper, here are 2 denarii. This is like a day's wage. When I come back, I'll pay you whatever else is owed, which is actually like Arnold Schwarzenegger saying, I'm coming back. It's a threat to the innkeeper saying, I'm coming back, you better take care of this guy. And at the end of the parable, Jesus says to the fellow, the lawyer, who proved to be neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? So the original question, who is my neighbor? Again, Jesus changes it. Who acted as neighbor? Who said, we're all in this together. We're all part of the same human condition. Who proved neighbor? And the poor lawyer can't bring himself to say Samaritan. Why? Because Jews and Samaritans, although really, really close, were enemies. Think North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam, more recently, Yankees and Red Sox. And I'm a Red Sox fan, my husband's a Yankees fan, it's difficult. They really did not like each other as close as they were. So the fellow can't say Samaritan, but he gets the right answer to Jesus' question, who proved neighbor? The man who showed mercy to the fellow who fell among the robbers. And Jesus says, now in a direct order, you go and do likewise. So why is this speaking to me? Because it's reminding me that I have to love everybody. It's reminding me not only do I have to love them, I have to care for them. I have to go out of my way to take care of people if I'm in a position to provide that help. And because of what's happening now in the Middle East, the geography works. Ancient Samaria, there are Samaritans to this day, by the way. Ancient Samaria is basically what's today called the West Bank, or areas A and C in the Middle East. So this is not Gaza, but this is another major location of the Palestinian population. So what does the parable sound like in contemporary discourse? I'm an Israeli Jew going down the Jerusalem to Jericho road. I'm waylaid by robbers, beaten, stripped, robbed, and left half dead in a ditch. And 2 people who should have stopped to help don't. The first one, a Jewish medic from the Israel Defense Force. And the second, a Quaker member of Witness for Peace. And the person who stops to help is a Palestinian Muslim member of Hamas. That's really hard to picture. But if we can just picture it, just imagine it, then it may help us think about things otherwise, as opposed to kill all these people, resist, and maybe there's a sense that if we can see the common humanity of all of us and be able to allow our compassion in Greek, the New Testament is written in Greek, it means something you feel in your guts, splanixai. If we could allow compassion to override politics, if we could let humanity override tribalism, maybe we could get somewhere. And I think that's why the parables of Jesus are so effective and why they pass that test of time. The problem is we'll always need them until that Messianic age comes. And the second problem is we don't pay enough attention to them.
So since you mentioned the Middle East, and you obviously get asked to speak on that situation, what are some further thoughts that you have about what has taken place, what continues to take place, and what you think the future holds over there?
I can't say what the future holds. I'm not a prophet. I'm an historian. I work backwards. Just about a year ago this week, I was supposed to have been in Germany. On October 7th last year, I was in Germany. I was in Bonn. Came back, and then was home for like 4 days, and then had to go back again. And American Airlines, as they say in the South, bless their heart, canceled my flight. So I'm now going to miss the meeting I was supposed to go to. So I'm thinking I have a week in Nashville. I don't have to go to a meeting. And I get a text from Imam Osama Balul. Some of you may know him. He's an old friend. And he says, I'm doing a program tomorrow. This is a Tuesday morning. I'm doing a program at Belmont University on October 7th, the Hamas attacks, and Israel had already started to bomb Gaza. So we're doing a program on the bombing of Gaza. I need you to come and be the Jew. I said, call a rabbi. He said, well, a rabbi was supposed to do this, but he has bronchitis. I said, call another rabbi. We have more than one. But this was the day that there was a march in Washington, D.C. in support of Israel, and all the rabbis were going to D.C. I said, I'm supposed to be in Munich. He said, it's something to the effect of, it's the will of Allah that you're in Nashville. So what am I going to do? So I go. And there may be 500 predominantly Muslim students there, plus a number of people from several of the mosques that we have in the area. I think I'm the only Jew in the room, and this is Belmont Denominally Baptist School. And I said to him, before we started, I said, we're not going to talk about politics, because I'm not a public policy person. I'm not a lawyer. We'll talk about this from a Jewish perspective and from a Muslim perspective. We'll talk about religion. He said, that's right. I said, what do you think they want to hear? And he gave me some extremely wise advice. He said, let them know that you feel their pain. I said, I have no problem doing that whatsoever. So what do we need to do, at least for those of us in the United States, to talk about this? I don't think stopping traffic is a terribly helpful way of getting people to pay attention to your concern. People are concerned. I do think speaking to people who might disagree with you is a very helpful thing to do. One does not negotiate with one's friends. One negotiates with people who disagree. Lawyers, corporate law, that's what you do. What I was able to explain to my new Muslim friends, all 500 of them at Belmont, they had no idea about Jewish attachment to the land of Israel. They thought all Jews were white. The majority, not vast majority, the majority of the Jewish population in the land of Israel comes from the Middle East and Latin America, from places like Yemen and Lebanon and Egypt and Libya, where there are no Jews today, by the way, and Argentina, and now France. Right? We are not all rich. We should be so lucky. But we look at the land of Israel as our national homeland. And what Jews need to realize is the Palestinian population looks at the land of Palestine as their national homeland too. And now what do we do when two people are claiming the same territory? And how do we be sure that people living in that land have some sort of equal rights, rather than Israeli settlers taking land away from Palestinian populations, which they've been doing, and rather than Palestinians hijacking buses and murdering people at music festivals and kidnapping senior citizens and babies. Nobody is behaving well. To recognize that criticism of a government does not mean criticism of the project of the state. I am not a fan of Benjamin Netanyahu. I am not a fan of his just recently firing another one of his ministers. I would like to see him make some sort of deal to bring the hostages home. It's been over a year. Is he going to get rid of Hamas? Of course not. And I would like to see Hamas lay down their weapons and try to figure out some better way of living in the Middle East rather than trying to kill people. Beyond that, picturing the humanity in everybody. My mother told me, you can tell my mother was my first theological educator. My mother told me when I was little that everybody is in the image and likeness of God. And I responded to my mother, even my aunt, I will not name her in case anybody sees this, but people who grew up in my hometown will know. My aunt who once said to me, you're stupid and ugly, but you do have good posture. I mean, she really said horrible things to me. And there were reasons for this that I learned when I was much older, so I came to understand why she said the horrible things that she said. But at the time, she was just awful to me. And I said to my mother, even my aunt, and my mother said, yes, even your aunt is in the image and likeness of God. And if we fail to see that, if we just see an army uniform, or if we just see a particular color, or if we see a flag or a scarf or whatever, we have to see that human face. That's where we start.
We are a day removed from an election in our country. I want to ask you about the concept of Christian nationalism that's gotten a lot of conversation, a lot of reporting. Do you have any thoughts on Christian nationalism? And maybe to be more specific, the utilization of Christianity to advance political objectives?
It seems to me that if Christians are going to pray, your kingdom come, the one they've got is not the one that they want. And I don't think the government's likely to provide it. I worry about Christian nationalism because it suggests in certain of its forms that it will take rights away from people who are not Christian, or from people who are not the right type of Christian. And I look at America as an experiment in democracy, and I don't want to see rights taken away from our friends who worship at the Hindu temple here in Nashville, or my friends who worship at the mosques, or my friends who worship in the synagogues. I don't want to see the Bible, particularly a Bible endorsed by a president and selling it, what is it, $60 a copy? I don't want to see those in the public school system. I think that's the job of religious institutions to teach people religion. On the other hand, because I'm trying to look at the good of everyone, I have some friends who would fall into the category Christian nationalists. So I'm trying to be sympathetic to their concerns. What are they concerned about? They're concerned about lack of morality in society, and they think that if more Christianity, like the Sermon on the Mount, could be brought into public discourse, there would be more morality. I'm not sure that would work, but that's what they think. They think it was horrible for prayer to go out of the public school system. Prayer has never gone out of the public school system. People pray always before an exam. It's just not formally led. I would like to see religious education where all religions are treated equally with respect. I think there's nothing wrong with that. So it's good to know about other people's religious traditions. They're concerned about particular ideological views being forced on people. And I understand their concerns. So they're worried, will their daughters be able to compete against people on girls' teams who were boys until they started having hormone treatment? I think that's a legitimate question. So rather than have this, you're horrible people, you Christian nationalists, you're fascists, you're superstitious yahoos, what I'm trying to do is talk with people to figure out what exactly is it that you want, and to what extent do your desires trample on my rights? And at the same time, I want them to see why they make me nervous. And they get it. Our problem in the United States, we go into our own little silos with our own little internet feeds, and we only listen to the people we want to listen to, and we don't listen to the others. And that's a fault of lack of civility, and I think it's a fault of lack of a sense of, again, we're all in the image and likeness of God.
Years ago, I asked Stanley Hauerwas what his greatest concern was about the future of Christianity in America. And he gave me a one-word answer, and it was idolatry. Idolatry. Not adultery, idolatry.
Once we turn anything into an idol, it's a problem. The difficulty with the single word answer is you get no traction on it. It sounds good, but then you have to figure out what counts. So is concern for the Christian church idolatry? Or is it a healthy concern? Is my concern for my own family or that my kids get a good education idolatry? Or is it a concern that's worth paying attention to? And the thing about idolatry is that idolaters don't know they're idolaters any more than heretics know they're heretics. They think they're right. You're only a heretic if you lose the historical battle. Right? I mean, you could all be heretics. We just won't know for another 100 years. So single word answers make me nervous. Whether it's secularism, egocentrism, fascism, Trumpism, Harrisism, whatever. Doesn't get us anywhere. And in fact, once you say to somebody, I think, oh, you're just engaging in idolatry, your conversation has now ended. Nothing else to say.
Needs to be unpacked and talked about. Do you see Jesus as a political figure in any way? He obviously was viewed as a political threat by the powers that be, but do you see Jesus, his teachings, his life, as being political, maybe not partisan, but political?
Well, I mean, I think he was certainly partisan. He thought he was right and everybody else was not quite as right as he was. But I think most of us think that way. He just got into print. It depends upon what you mean by political. Is concern for the poor a political concern? If it is, then he's political. Is speaking about the kingdom of heaven political? Sure, because kingdom language is political. That's a political term. Or king is a political term. Is saying, I have a better way of understanding law than you do. Political, absolutely. So we get back to the question of Stanley Hauerwas and labels. What happens if we label Jesus political? So what's at stake in the label? And a number of people say, oh, no, he's not political because he says, my kingdom is not of this world. That's only in the Gospel of John. But we have other concerns which are not so otherworldly. And there's even much in the Gospel of John, which means you pay attention to what's going on in this world. So that's okay. God liked the answer. I'm listening to the little jingle. It's fine. So yeah, I mean, I think he was political, but I also think he thought the end of the world was around the corner. And what he's doing is he's preparing his followers to live as if they've got one step in the kingdom of heaven already. There's an old Jewish saying for everything. There's an old rabbinic saying that says, repent one day before you die. Okay. So what does that mean? You know, it's the end of the day, and you take inventory. What did I do right? Let's celebrate and thank God I got to do that. What did I do wrong? What do I need? What must I fix now? Was I sharp with my partner? Then I need to go say I'm sorry, right? Did I forget to call my daughter? Then I better send her a text before the morning comes around. Repent one day before you die. And that's kind of the way Jesus is focusing here. If you knew the end of the world was coming shortly, how would you reorient your life? That's a political question, it's an economic question, it's a healthcare question, and it's an important question. And I think, because I actually do pay attention to Jesus, that I try to live with that on my mind. What could I have done better? What do I need to do tomorrow? To whom do I need to say I'm sorry? Bless you. If the world was going to end next week, what should I have done that I did not do? And at that point, I'm going to do it.
You've had a long friendship with Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, and one of the things that he says often is, you know, he says Christianity is not just about going to heaven when you die. You know, a lot of people, they think that's the goal, that's all about going to heaven when you die. He says, no, there's a lot of work to be done right now, and Jesus gives us some marching orders for what that looks like.
Right, I mean, in the Sermon on the Mount, he wasn't kidding. Right, I mean, he really wasn't. He's not saying this is some good advice, but yeah, you take it or leave it. He's saying he's there as a new Moses from a mountaintop teaching his followers how to follow Torah. This is highly serious. I was going to say dead serious, but it's live serious.
Mm-hmm. Right. And he was very concerned, at least from my understanding, about heart and motive. And you've heard it said, but I say to you, taking it back a step. Do you agree with that?
Not exactly.
Oh, goodness.
Because I don't think he said, you have heard it said, but I say to you, because that suggests an antithesis. This, but that. This, not that. An antithesis is an opposite. This, but that. An antithesis would be, you have heard it said, you shall not murder, but I say to you, lock and load. That's an antithesis. The word for but in the Greek is not the strong but. The Greek term would be Allah, it's de. It's like in Matthew's genealogy, and Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob, Jacob was the father Joseph and his brothers and Judah and all that. It doesn't mean but Jacob was the father. It just means and. So what I think Jesus is doing is not engaging in antithetical concerns. He's not doing opposites. He's doing extensions. And that's where we get to that internal stuff, the heart stuff. Because if you can get your heart wrapped around what you're supposed to do, then the rest of you follows normally. So my friend Julia, it's what Alexander's violin teachers called muscle memory, that you do it enough times that you don't have to think about it. Does that make sense? I'm looking at the cellist. Okay. So you get this kind of muscle memory. And the heart is a muscle, and the heart has muscle memory. So if you train your heart to be compassionate and sympathetic and kind, then it gets easier and easier to do. So you have heard it said, don't murder. And I say to you, don't be angry. Because if you're not angry with somebody, you're less likely to murder. This is what Rabbinic Judaism calls building a fence about the law. We have a law, we make another law to make sure you don't violate the first one. Nashville, building a fence about the law, you're going down Harding Road and you hit Belmead, where the speed limit is 40. Nobody drives at 40 miles an hour. So I think this is just Belmead making things easy for the little city. So what do? When you hit Belmead, you make your cruise control on 38. That way there's no possibility you will exceed the speed limit. The Belmead police will not stop you. Everything is fine. You've just made a fence about the law. Don't be angry. You're less likely to murder. You have heard it said, don't commit adultery. I say to you, not and I say to you, don't think about it. Because if you don't think about it, then you're not going to plan it. And if you're not going to plan it, you're less likely to do it.
Does that mean you don't like the NRSV translation that uses the word but? Or are you just saying that doesn't really capture what he's...
I think it's an unhelpful translation because it sets up an opposite.
Weren't you involved with that translation?
I was not.
Oh, okay. Gosh.
I was asked to do the translation for the Gospel of Matthew, and I declined because I was very busy at the time. But I said, when you're done with your translation, if you want me to look it over, I would be happy to do that. Not only to look over the translation, but also to look over the new annotations for the Oxford Annotated 6, which is coming out. And they said, no, thanks. So there's a new translation out called the NRSV, New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. Yep. And I'm not particularly happy with it. But it gives me something to write about in my spare time.
Yep. Your most recent book that came out this year, I believe, or recently, is called Jesus for Everyone. I've not finished it. I've read a good chunk of it. Tell us about the book. Why did you write it? Why should everybody go out and buy it?
It's called Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians. It came out in August. It was when the press, this is Harper One Press, when the press originally contracted it, they wanted me to call it Jesus for Atheists. And I started working on, and I didn't like it, because I thought, I don't want to talk just to atheists. I think believers should pay attention to Jesus too. Whether they're Jewish believers or Muslim believers or Hindu believers or whatever, let alone Christian believers. So we came up with Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians, which I'm happy with. And the idea in the book was to say, what are the hot button issues in contemporary society? Family values, politics, economics, healthcare, self and other, who's in and who's out, slavery, because we're still talking about slavery and the legacy of slavery. So I thought I could write a book looking at these hot button issues by looking at words attributed to Jesus, parables told by Jesus, stories told about Jesus, like controversy narratives or the passion narrative, and look at some of the parables I did not look at in my earlier book, and say, how do the Gospels help us think our way through some of these questions, some of these issues? The Bible is not a one-size-fits-all book, and it's not the sort of thing where if you have a question, you open it up like the magic 8-ball and say, what verse do I find today? God forbid you land in the book of Job. I think the Bible is a book that helps us ask the right questions. So how can we use these gospel stories to help us focus better? Because if we can discuss these difficult issues regarding the gospel stories, we then become in a better position to discuss those difficult issues in a class, in a reading group, in a community, in a church discussion. So plus I like Jesus, so I wrote a book about Jesus, because I think he's smart.
So I want to ask you one more question, and then we're going to open it up, because I know you all probably have questions, and we've covered a lot of ground tonight, but it's more of a personal question. At this stage in your life, you retired a few years ago from Vanderbilt. Some of us went to the party. It was great. But what are you doing now, and also what brings you the greatest joy at this stage of your life?
The day after my retirement from Vanderbilt came through on August 15th, 2021 at noon. You know those times. I immediately took a job at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, which is in Hartford, Connecticut. It's a graduate program, master's and doctorate, that works in Jewish, Christian, Muslim dialogue. It primarily trains chaplains, hospital chaplains, military chaplains, and so on. And it's designed to help Jewish chaplains learn about Christianity and Islam, and Muslim chapters learn about Judaism and Christianity, and so on. And I thought, how fabulous to teach for a couple of years in this more Jewish, Christian, Muslim connection, where I'm teaching New Testament to Jews and Muslims who have never read the Gospels, and to Christians who haven't read them quite as closely as I make them read it. I did not want another full-time job, so the president of Hartford said, well, how about you just come up to Connecticut for 1 month a year, and you'll teach an intensive both on-site and online. And I said, when? He said January. I said, no. He said, how about June? And I thought, June in Connecticut? That's okay. So the first contract which was for 3 years, ended this past August. And I just signed a new contract, which has me no longer teaching courses, because I am never going to write another syllabus and never going to grade another paper, but to come up 2 or 3 times a year to do workshops for local clergy, workshops for students and residents, workshops that will be available globally because we can stream them, we can Zoom them. What gives me joy?
Speaking at churches.
I really like speaking in churches. I like the questions people ask, and if you have a question and you don't get to ask it tonight, you can always email me. My Vanderbilt email still works, and I have a Facebook page. I don't know how it works, by the way, so once a week my daughter tells me if there's something on Facebook to which I need to respond. I like it when I can help people. I really like it when I can disrupt anti-Semitism, when I can disrupt some of the anti-Christian comments that I've heard in synagogues, because, again, we've all got baggage. I like it when I can help people be better neighbors and better strangers. I like it when we can look at the Bible and different people will have different readings of the same text. I find that fascinating. I like hanging out with my friends. I like to knit. I like to walk the dog. I mean, it's just like normal things that people do. And I like not going to committee meetings. One of the benefits of retirement.
We can get you on a committee at the church.
Thanks, no.
Okay. We're going to open this up now. If you have a question for AJ Levine, put your hand up. Again, remember, it needs to be somewhat short. It needs to be a question, and we'll open it up here. So, got one down front.
What do you think of the divinity of Jesus and the resurrection?
I think if you're a Christian, believing in the divinity of Jesus and the resurrection makes sense. Paul says if the resurrection didn't happen, the whole thing is just kind of silly, so why bother? But in order to believe that, you have to have faith in that. So how do you get faith in the first place? Your question's a very good question. For me, I've just never felt that call. The Gospel of John makes it pretty clear, as I understand John, that the only way you can come to this faith is if you're called to it. I don't think faith is an intellectual exercise. I don't think it's a matter of the head. I don't think it's a matter of study. I think it's more the matter of the heart, to go back to that heart thing. And where one person's heart resonates, another person's heart may not. For me personally, my heart is completely fulfilled by my own Judaism, so I'm not feeling like any sort of gap that the divinity of Jesus needs to come in and fill, or that the resurrection would change my way of functioning in the world. Jews already have resurrection on the books. We just don't have like a one-off and then everybody else. We've got an everybody else at the same time. The model that I use to describe it is that faith is more like love than it's like Sudoku. It's not logical. So I've just never felt that call. But when it comes to the proclamation of the New Testament, the proclamation of the Gospels or the proclamation of Paul in the New Testament, I don't think they're making it up. I don't think a bunch of people got together one day, so let's make up the resurrection. I think they're entirely sincere. Could you catch it on a camera? I don't know. But did they believe it enough so that it changed their lives? Absolutely. And I think that needs to be respected.
So what do you do with the passages then where Jesus talks about being one with God, or, equating Jesus with God?
The Gospel of, thank you for the question. So we're primarily here in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says things like, I and the Father are one. And John's basic idea, what we would call Christology, technically words about Jesus, but how John understands Jesus, is John understands that Jesus is the embodiment, the enfleshment, the embodiment of the God of Israel. So the only way for John to understand the God of Israel is to understand who Jesus is. And if you don't get Jesus, you don't get God. And the only way to be, for John, a child of God, is to be called by God through Jesus, so to be called by Jesus. I disagree with John. So this is what I'm likely to do. In the same way that or a similar way, not quite the same way, that if a Muslim were to say, well, why don't you believe in Muhammad as the final prophet and in Allah, the Christian might say, well, because I don't, because I believe in Jesus. And the Muslim will say, well, but why don't you believe? And again, it's not an intellectual, there's no way intellect can get you there. The only way one comes to believe in Jesus is because one feels it in here, one feels it in the heart. I don't feel it. But I don't want to take away that feeling from anybody else. What I want to do is affirm it and say, if you believe, terrific. And then my next question, what are you going to do about it? So in class on occasion, because my students would typically ask the same question, so you're going to believe in the resurrection. And I would tell them what I just told you. And then I would kind of reverse the questions, is answering a question with a question. To say, okay, so you believe in the resurrection of Jesus, terrific. No problem with that. What difference does it make in your life? And most of them had never thought about it that way. And I think that's the most important question. If you believe Jesus came back from the dead, that's amazing. What difference does it make to your own life? How better does one understand the Sermon on the Mount? Or because the proclamation is Jesus came, the body he dies in is the body he comes back in, right? Empty tomb. Okay. Well, that means bodies are important, because he could have come back as a spirit, like a disembodied spirit. He doesn't. That means bodies are important. Well, if bodies are important, that means flesh is important. So do you have health care? Do you watch your cholesterol? Do you make sure people have clean water? What are you doing about other people who are in the body, because being in the body, both incarnation and resurrection are in the body. So what difference does belief in resurrection make in your own lives? And for me, that's the better question.
Other questions? Cyril, right there. Yeah.
I really appreciate you being here, and every time I hear you, I hear with different ears than I've grown up with. And so how do we separate out, how do we determine whether our interpretation is hearing what Jesus was trying to say, or hearing what 73 years of growing up in America has said to me?
Oh my goodness. Well, because we don't. It's guesswork. It's just really well-informed guesswork. So how do we do this? There are ways you can do it. There are certain negative controls. If the reading you get from the New Testament tells you that Jews are horrible people, probably not a good reading, because Jesus is working among Jews. He is a Jew, and he never ceases to be a Jew. If a reading we come up with suggests that we should hate other people, I think that's unhelpful. Right? How do we get better control? So here's my experiment with the parables. And this actually does take some work. Look at the words that are used and see how those words or those stories show up in the scriptures of Israel, what the church would call the Old Testament. Who are the Samaritans? You know, we can't understand the parable of the Good Samaritan unless we understand Jewish-Samaritan relations at the time. Now, here we can be lucky, because sometimes the gospel writers will tell us. Right? So Luke, bless his heart, he got this one right. One chapter before the parable of the Good Samaritan, so parables in Luke chapter 10, at the end of Luke chapter 9, Jesus and the entourage are heading from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south. And it takes them like 9 chapters to get there, from chapter 9 to chapter 18. And at the end of chapter 9, they stop in a Samaritan village, and Jesus is looking for hospitality. Basically, he needs a room at the inn. Right? And the Samaritans refuse him hospitality because he's a Jew and he's heading toward Jerusalem, because Jews and Samaritans don't get along. The Gospel of John tells us that. At this point, James and John, 2 of the apostles, say, "Lord, shall we call down fire from heaven to destroy this village?" It's an allusion to the destruction of Sodom, which according to the prophet Ezekiel was destroyed because of lack of hospitality. Right? And Jesus has to explain that dropping a bomb is not an appropriate response to lack of hospitality. So we know something even from Luke about Jewish-Samaritan relations. We can read the writings of Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, to figure out what Rome is doing. We can read the Dead Sea Scrolls to get a sense of other people who thought the end of the world was around the corner and how they lived their lives in light of that urgency of the end time. We can read rabbinic documents to see how other Jews are interpreting the Torah at the time, and noting that the rabbis don't always agree. In fact, they usually don't agree. The one thing they agree on is that Torah is important. After that, they can disagree as much as they want. Why? Because they're all neighbors. They're all within that same community, so they can disagree better. And then we use the resources that we have. We will never know for sure. When reading the Bible, I think the best way of starting, I got this idea from a Bible scholar named Mark Allen Powell, who just recently retired from Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio. Mark says, when reading the Bible, the first question we ask is, what does this text mean to me? Not what did it mean back then, not what does it mean to the church, not what does it mean to the pastor, what does it mean to me? Most important question you can ask, but you don't stop there. Then you ask your neighbors, what do you think? You read the histories. What do the scholars think? You ask the church, what do you think? You go back a year later and you read it again, and you allow those different interpretations to settle. But you'll never know for sure. There's always a risk in reading the Bible, but it's a risk worth taking.
There was Francis up here in the middle. Good question so far.
Fabulous questions.
Hi.
Hi.
So I know you're familiar with Professor Bart Ehrman at Chapel Hill. So I just took one of his online courses that's called Jesus versus Paul, the Great Divide. And his thesis essentially is that the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Paul are radically different to the point of being largely irreconcilable. And he basically is saying in a nutshell that Jesus was about following the law, repenting, and you will be forgiven for your sins. Whereas Paul is teaching, don't worry about the law, you don't need to follow it. The only path to salvation is accepting the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus as the atonement for the sins of mankind. So Ehrman suggests that those are remarkably different and irreconcilable. What do you think?
Yeah. So Bart's a good friend, and if you pay attention to Bart's courses, I have one on Bart's website, so you can go take a course from me from Bart. I think Bart and I would agree that Paul is focused toward Gentiles and Paul is focused toward the meaning of the Christ regarding salvation. And Jesus, at least in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is much more interested in Jewish ethics. But I don't think they're so radically opposed as that. I think we look at them as marketing to different audiences. And Bart would agree on this. Bart sees Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet who is expecting the end of the world to come like a week from Tuesday. And he's preparing his people to live in light of that moment. I think Paul is doing the same thing. But Paul, as a first century Jew, and indeed as a Pharisee, Paul's a Pharisee, Jesus is not. And Paul never stops being a Pharisee. He just thinks because he found Jesus, he's a better Pharisee. Paul takes the one dominant Jewish idea was that when the Messianic age began, one of the signs of the Messianic age is that the Gentiles, the pagans, turn from worshiping their pagan gods to worshiping the God of Israel. And they kind of get morality along with. So Paul, who perceives himself because of his road to Damascus experience, as now the former persecutor who's now the promoter, Paul identifies himself in Romans as the apostle to the Gentiles. So what Paul is doing is taking a very Jewish movement, and attempting to explain it to a bunch of non-Jews. Completely different audience means completely different approach. So for Paul, being a Jew, he knows that when the Messianic age begins, the Gentiles don't all convert to Judaism. Because if they did, then the only people who would be worshiping God would be Jews. But the Messianic age, one of the signs is that everybody worships the God of Israel, Jews and Gentiles and Samaritans all together. So if all the Gentiles converted to Judaism, which means following the law, then the only people who would be worshiping God are Jews, and that defeats the Messianic purpose. So, does Paul more stress a religion built around Jesus than Jesus stressing a religion built around Torah? Yeah, but it's a different audience. So I don't see them as all that antithetical, because Paul, like Jesus, is insisting over and over again in his letters that these Gentiles need to get with the program. And the program is feed people who are hungry, take care of people who need help, take care of the poor. Don't steal, don't get drunk, don't lie, don't cheat. So that every single one of Paul's letters has what's in Greek called paranesis, ethical exhortation. Jesus is interested in the same thing, and Paul is preparing his people for the end of the world and to live as if it's around the corner. So I don't think they're all that different. It's just different marketing with a different audience.
Time for maybe one more, and then we have to wind down tonight.
Well, we have two more women, so we're taking the two women.
Two more. We got two more.
Well, I have heard you speak and have heard you say that about waiting for a call. But yet, probably most people here that are Christians probably don't feel like they've had a call, but they have probably followed the things that you mentioned about studying, looking at different things. There are different ways, but do you feel perhaps that you were called to study Jesus because some way you were called, or do you think that was just a decision, or how did you get into this study of Jesus?
A number of my friends think that I was called, like there's some transcendent power out there that just looked at me when I was 7 years old and said, "Hail, Amy Jill, and you're going to spend your life hanging out with Jesus." I don't know. This goes back to your question before. I don't have that kind of mystical sense of, I'm a historian. My mother was a mathematician, right? I grew up in a very rationally based household. I just know that this is what seems right to me. I guess when people fall in love, do you feel called to fall in love, or do you just fall in love? So, I don't know, calling is not the language that I would use, but it may be appropriate. I don't know. Why am I doing this? Because I am so damn tired of watching people hurt each other because of religion. I'm tired of Jews not being able to know the genius of Jesus' teaching, because a lot of us are Jesus-phobic. I'm tired of Christians acting in anti-Semitic ways and making anti-Semitic proclamations. And they don't even realize they're doing it, right? It's just because we don't hear our own privilege, we don't hear our own bigotry. And I'm tired of people not being the best that we can be. And if I can have anything to do, and not just my kids, who actually turned out okay, I want people to be better neighbors, and I want Christians to have a better sense of what the goodness of the gospel is, and I want Jews to have a better sense of Jesus and Paul as figures in Judaism, so that even if they're not authoritative, like the Dead Sea Scrolls are not authoritative, I still think they're important to know.
Well, thank you. I think you've been a good influence on us all.
I'm doing my damnedest.
Do we have one more?
We have one more.
Hi, my name is Judith.
Hi, Judith.
We have a lot in common. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew.
Yeah?
That means from Europe, for those who don't know, European Jew. You spoke, I have a sense of humor, like you do. You spoke about being sympathetic, passionate, and kind, but you also said that you were not a fan of Netanyahu. And I think it's a really tough time for me to hear that. And I'm a Cohen, you're a Levi, but I'm wondering, why would you say that you were not a fan?
I'm concerned about his dealings with criminal court issues. I'm concerned about at least 2 of the members in his cabinet who have made horrible comments about Palestinians, calling them animals, for example. And I think if I had somebody like that on my payroll, I would ask that person at least to apologize, if not to leave. Because again, I don't like the idea of dehumanizing people. I'm concerned about what he attempted to do regarding the judiciary and strip it of its powers, because I really like the idea of, this is the American in me, that I do like separate branches of government that should be able to serve as checks and balances. And I find that not to be helpful. And I think there were a couple of missed opportunities regarding hostages. I am a Zionist. I am very much in favor of Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people. There are parts of Israeli society that very much disturb me. There are also parts of American society that very much disturb me, but I'm also an American, and I'm proud to be an American. So I feel as a Jew who has that connection, who has family there, who has friends there, I don't think their government is doing as much as it could or should. But my Zionism remains unabated. You're welcome.
I think we're going to have to stop it there. Let's thank A.J. Levine for being here tonight, coming to share. Always great to have her.
Thank you. Thank you. And if you have questions, you can always email me.
I'm going to say a short prayer, and then I know she'll hang out for just a minute. But thank you all for being here tonight. And 2 weeks from tonight, we'll have our all-church Thanksgiving dinner downstairs, and we're going to hear from a lot of our different outreach ministries that are impacting this community. So make sure you come on the 20th. Let's say a prayer. Loving God, thank you for this gathering. Thank you for Dr. Levine, for her scholarship, the many lives that she has impacted and molded over the years through her teaching, and for the friendship that we have with her at this church. We pray for our nation as we move forward from an election, and we pray that all of us can dive deeper into Scripture, wrestle with the nuances, try to understand what it's saying to the community at the time, to us today. All this I pray in Christ's name. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you. What fun. You have smart people in your church.
They'll tell you to.
Yeah, that's good.
My dad.
That's your dad?
He's my dad. He was in Memphis for a long time. He's been on my staff for, No.